Two very, very interesting talks, and probably the contrast is obvious to everyone. And to some degree, the contrast I characterize as Tundi's discussion is of a vision or a dream, a good dream. And Brian described a nightmare. And one of the things that distinguishes the two is that Brian's is laden with all sorts of details and specifics, whereas Tundi's discussion is a lot more abstract and intangible. And that's in part because Brian's is real, it's actually happening. And some aspects of what Tundi's describing are happening, but a lot of them, people haven't quite invented how to make them happen. There are issues of what's the legal framework, going beyond just talking it, but actually somebody having the authority to actually put things in place. Some of that's developing in Europe, perhaps faster than here, although there's a lot of talk here. The story that Brian described, and I could, take sides on either side of it, having been involved in it from so many different dimensions, is quite interesting. And one thing that's important is to recognize the history of how we got here. Brian described a system that has a starting date of the fishing year of May 1st. Does anybody have any idea why the starting day is May 1st?
That goes back way in history.
It does go back in history. It goes back in history to the beginning of the implementation of the Magnuson Act. Peter may remember this. But, okay, well, in about 1979 or 80 or 81, when the system first was implemented, there were quotas. And the industry caught up its year's worth of quota, starting January 1, by about March 15th. And so the fishery was to be closed. And a number of Congress people intervened with strong threatening letters saying the Department of Commerce or NOAA will no longer exist if this fishery is closed. One of them was Ted Kennedy. I mean, I personally was involved and saw this. One of them was Studs,
Yeah.
former New Bedford person, and several other Congress people that are still in office, so I won't mention their names, but they're prominent in New England, basically threatened that if the system, if the fisheries closed, government departments would suffer. And so they invented a way to deal with it, and it was called Restart the Clock. And it happened to fall on May 1st. So the reason the fishing year starts on May 1st is because they ran out of fish and they restarted the clock. Now, I tell you that because it's symbolic of the controversy and the polarized situation, which through till about when Peter Shelley was involved in the lawsuits in '94 and so forth, it was very, very one-sided. Essentially, the industry controlled and the agency was told what to do until there were lawsuits that turned the system around gradually. I mean, it didn't happen all at once, to where where basically the U.S. is now recognized as having one of, if not the most conservation-oriented fisheries management systems in the world. But unfortunately, that process took a good idea like health insurance and created all the worst things you could imagine through a political process where it's now hard to say what's good and what isn't. And that's what we're suffering through. And it's interesting because of that incredibly polarized, politicized process. One that I think is at this stage dysfunctional in terms of what was supposed to be a co-management process involving councils which were working with the stakeholders. We've actually created a framework with a tremendous amount of apparatus in terms of legal systems, guidelines, rules, lawyers everywhere, that if anything is anti an ecosystem approach. It's going in the opposite direction of what Tundi envisioned, because it's become so reactionary that if one fish stock happened to be overfished, which is ultimately going to be necessary to go to an ecosystem approach, that's again Congressman so-and-so calling up and bullying the agency. And so I really do think that we've got a huge mess that, in fact, in part interests me because it's sort of reflective of the body politic as a whole. It's almost polarized to the point of being dysfunctional.
Well, that's a great way of
And
framing
I've
it.
had my say.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, in many respects, and I'll allow Brian to get his thoughts and then open up for conversation. But you know, if you're thinking about it, in some respects, in very gross ways, we have this sort of broad dichotomy or broad continuum between absolute property rights notions, how we approach the sort of common pool. That's just assigned property rights. That was what was done with quotas and other kind of things. Or even all the way toward, which is again, it's a very minimal government approach in some respects. It has to do with sort of assign property rights and then sort of keep an eye on things, all the way to active management, very, very integrated, very active, sort of strong governmental role, strong community role. So we have this sort of like broad continuum here, and along this continuum are various kinds of answers. And obviously the question is, where's, if there is a sweet spot, where is it? So Brian, do you have a comment you want to make?
Yeah, I'd respond backwards. First of all, with respect to property rights, when we were all studying resource economics, we learned about the tragedy of the commons and we learned about sole owner resources, so on and so forth. And one of the fascinating things about the present state of management is that you can't, well, I shouldn't say you can't, I can't figure out who owns what and who does what. And I'm often reminded of the simple ideas of consumer surplus and producer surplus, and when the government puts regulations in, you affect that surplus. The government has so many interconnected regulations that you really can't figure out who owns what, and so that's a problem. The second thing, Mike said it's a polarized process, and he's absolutely right. The interesting question is do we start with a polarized do we start with problems and generate the polarization, or do we start with polarization and generate the problems? And finally, I've thought about presentations like Tundi's for a long time, because we all want to be sustainable. We all want to have ecosystem-based management. We all want to have a healthy ocean. The problem is, from an operational point of view, is what is a healthy ocean and what is an unhealthy ocean. And we have a problem managing one species at a time. You put two species together, we don't know how to do it. At least I'm not aware of ever seeing anybody doing that, let alone manage a whole ecosystem. So there are major technical problems that arise when you try to address these higher level goals. So that would be my three comments.
Okay. Tundi, do you have a comment before we open to questions?
Yeah, just to bounce off on I think there's no question about it that it's very challenging and very complex, and a lot of it is kind of probably idealistic. And I think the way that you get to the actual nuts and bolts of doing this is through a process that actually Michael's written and talked about a lot, which is to do a kind of scaling so that you employ different kinds of policy and different kinds of management tools at different scales. And at the community and kind of local scale, it does make sense to do this kind of active engagement of user groups, look for co-management opportunities, have dialogues, tell stories, do all the things that can ultimately affect human behavior. Because at that scale, human behavior matters. But when you start to move up in scale, you can't rely on those kinds of tools anymore. So if you start to look at the national scale, and Massachusetts has done a lot of, made a lot of advances, I think is probably leading the country more than any other state in thinking about all these kinds of different activities, impacts, doing human use mapping, for instance, and understanding who is doing what where. When you start to move up to the state level, then you can't really think about active engagement of all of the stakeholders, really really making that process as as much of a kind of interactive process as you could at the local level. And when you move up to the federal government, and of course the international community, there you need true leadership. You need to have people that are going to make tough decisions. They're going to take decisions probably in a way that isn't probably as democratic as you could achieve at the local scale. But you need to have that leadership. So I think at different levels you employ different kinds of tools and different sorts of ways of engagement. The other thing that I'd say is that I think there are two things that help us out in terms of getting the complicated business of marine and coastal management, integrated management right. And one is that we have to learn by managing and do truly adaptive management. So we have to understand that we're going to go into every situation with some degree of uncertainty. We don't understand the dynamics of most marine ecosystems. We don't understand human impacts on those ecosystems well enough. But as we manage, we derive more and more information. So our understanding becomes more fruitful. And part of the regulatory regime has got to be, or part of the policy has got to be, that management has to be revisited and adapted all the time, amended. The other thing I want to say is there have to be performance standards. So if you're using, for instance, ocean zoning, we're not talking about, this kind of crazy idealized world in which all the users are happy because you kept the fishing out of the very delicate, sensitive areas, and you pushed it out into an area where there's less sensitivity, but you still have to manage, and you still have to have some kind of very specific performance standards, which if not being met, then you have to amend the management. So those are two things I'll say in defense of the kind of idealized thing that I.
Well, let's open up for general questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and direct who you're directing your question to. Anybody? Sure. Guy, go ahead.
I'm Guy. I have a question I'm not sure who could best answer. I was listening here and I'm kind of interested in how the policy and everything, the regulations going around fisheries and was so industry sided. How did it become so pretty much agency government sided? When did that happen? How did it happen? I mean, you said briefly it was sort of like a series of lawsuits or something. I'm curious as to how it happened.
It was really in the United States. Before 1976, there was a continual buildup of foreign fishing, and at the same time, I think it was off of Argentina. They extended their jurisdiction, and that generated what was called the Truman Doctrine, and that came together with the idea of getting the foreign fishing fleets out, and that related to treaties that we had with NAFO, and Mike knows more about that than I do. And at any rate, and Senator Magnuson, who was from the state of Washington, he was heavily involved in creating, along with Bud Walsh, who was his staff person, basically wrote it, the Fishery Conservation and Management Act of 1976. And so the basic idea at that time was that the shining light were these 8 regional councils. And at last, I remember Magnuson giving a speech. So at last we have the people that are most affected by the resources having their hand on making the decisions that affect them the most. And then in the evolution of time, the 8 councils went their separate ways. There were a lot of complaints because the people on the councils were related to industry, and so it was broadened out to a wider range of stakeholders. And what you have is today, I mean, New England is very unusual with respect to the rest of the country in having these problems.
So there was a fragmentation of stakeholders.
Yeah.
Well, but the new policy, you want to speak to the new policy? I mean,
Well, I mean, you have to remember that It's only 120 years ago or so that Huxley, the greatest scientist of his time, basically said that the major ocean fisheries are inexhaustible. And essentially, the theme was, it didn't matter, go out there and catch the herring, the cod, whatever. It's interesting that the Woods Hole Laboratory had already established that the halibut fishery off of this area collapsed at the time he said that. It's never really recovered. But anyway, that was the epic until basically the big factory trawlers showed up off of New England. There were already jurisdictional coastal issues because of the U.S. Pacific tuna fleet, which was boats being seized in Peru. You remember that era, Brian? But basically there was the view was the null hypothesis is do it until somebody tells you you can't or proves you can't. And that existed until the mid-70s. And even after that, the first fishery management plan in New England was for cod, haddock, and yellowtail flounder. Everything else was unregulated. And it took a while before people realized that, no, if you just leave things totally unregulated, they're going to go to hell. And all this apparatus is built up over that period of time with tremendous controversy. New England is different for a couple of reasons. One is, the West Coast fisheries, basically fisheries management amounted to kicking the foreigners out, and you solve the overfishing problem. Basically get the Russian fleet out, the Polish fleet. New England, they'd already been kicked out under something called ICNAF, which became NAFO. And they were still being overfished domestically. So the New England system started off with a problem to solve. The West Coast system started off with a problem to solve. It was easy, get rid of the foreigners. That was the popular thing to do. So, it just automatically started out in a much more polarized situation.
Next question, you have things right here?
Yeah, sure. First, just want to say, I don't know if this was supposed to be an open seminar. I'm actually in Wednesday night's Demography is Destiny course.
This is an open group?
And so, yeah, that said, I appreciate the invite. That's how I found the email. I work for Affiliate Media, and we're actually a small media company, Boston-based, young group of artists, and we're actually working on a project right now that's, first of all, we build creative content. We implement interactive platforms and the content that sustains them. So essentially, web design and web media, everything from film, photography, and basically, we're creating a social network that is focused on local sustainability initiatives.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I'm wondering what is the bonding would be what would unite the sectors? It's kind of something I propose to all of you. We're researching right now what the different sectors are and how to actually bring them together. And I guess you could probably speak to that, and maybe you as well. You sound like a lot of
the fisheries sectors, or
actually kind of the sectors, the conservationists, as well as the fishery sectors specifically.
Well, so the issue with the conservationists is that the two groups basically don't talk, so they could start by talking to one another. And I think that the conservationists would benefit a lot, and so would the people that harvest the resource. What was the second one?
Yeah, no, that was spot on. I mean, really, the idea is
Can
through.
I make a?
Sure.
So there is now, I think, a very hopeful new development, which is this Marine Spatial Planning Initiative. The Obama policy, the National Ocean Policy, has set up, it's committed to ecosystem-based management and using marine spatial planning as a tool. So they have now set up 8 regional councils for planning that follow the same kind of pattern as the fisheries councils, so the same regions. So we have a New England region. And that will be an attempt to get everybody at the table in terms of all the different sectors to figure out to develop actually a common vision. This is something I didn't mention, this kind of visioning step, but it's a very, very important step, I think, for this complicated kind of management, to make sure that everybody is striving towards the same goal.
Sure.
And it's interesting how reachable that kind of common visioning is if you just get people in the same room. So part of it is talking to one another, but having this kind of framework in place so that that dialogue can take place, I think is really going to be critical. And New England will be probably the first region to be able to achieve anything far ahead of any other region in the country.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I'm Jed Schwartz. I'm a blogger from Somerville, and aspirations to be sort of a political activist and meddler.
Agitate.
And so I'm interested to know more about the status quo, the way things are now, in terms of how the interactions and dynamics between corporate boats, corporate fleets, unions, and the Obama policy and the Republican, deregulate, privatize everything. People, where do they fit in? Are they so far on the outskirts, or are they on the horizon, looming menacingly? That can either or any of the speakers help me in this department?
I could give you sort of a rundown in the fishing ports in New England have shrunk. In other words, Portland was an active port. It's no longer a port. The two biggest ports are New Bedford and Gloucester. And New Bedford is the #1 port economically in the country. The reason for that is that it lands $280 million worth of scallops every year. The value of the ground fish is maybe $20 or $30 million. Gloucester's the #10 port. They mostly ground fish in small boats. There's not much industrialization, you might say, as of now. If it follows the clam industry, which became an ITQ system about a decade ago, you'll see that consolidation. The scallop industry has a consolidation cap of I think it's 5%, and that's by far the biggest industry in New England. So what this catch share system is going to do, it's going to concentrate wealth into fewer people. We have one gentleman in New Bedford who owns 40 draggers, and so he thinks he's a big wheel, and he is, but at some point I think he will be gobbled up economically by offshore interests until we have some laws against that, which we probably will have. So
you've seen, no matter what has happened over the years, that we've seen consolidation. Just no matter what the solution has been, it seems, whether it's been quota systems, technology forcing boat sizes, it's always been consolidation.
Yeah. The basic problem is the days at sea system that when you're down to 20 days, you can't make money on a single economic entity. You have to put things together. And we have one scallop. We actually have 2 or 3 that own about 25 scallopers. And so
that was happening before catch shares.
Yes, it was. Oh, absolutely.
They were already doing that.
Yeah, that had nothing to do with catch shares.
So the image in our heads of the lone boat owner going out on his or her own to sort of catch fish is really an antiquated notion increasingly. If it already isn't it already out the window?
It's very dynamic now, and you're going to see. I mean, there's agreement among the draggers and the people I talk to that the single boat owners are a thing of the past, and the scallop people they want to really consolidate, but there's a tension inside the industry between the people who have 25 boats to get the number of days at sea, and the people who have 1 boat. So,
but those consolidation rules can be made by the industry itself, through the Magnuson Act. The surf clams you mentioned was already vertically integrated into a relatively small number of companies. And the council at the time, when it set up the program, made a conscious decision to only regulate through antitrust law and not to have any other consolidation rules. And it was a decision that was made by a quasi-democratic process. Halibut on the West Coast have some consolidation rule that's pretty restrictive, such that there hasn't been anywhere near the consolidation that would have occurred if there weren't rules against it.
It's about 5 more minutes, and I want to make sure
can you mention some of the small, for lack of a better term, or kind of boutique fisheries, not in the sense of small fisheries in Massachusetts, such as the Cape Cod Hook and Line Association fishers and the harpoon swordfish fishery. highly sustainable, haven't been consolidated, very profitable, and are kind of, I think, looking at the whole opportunities that the MSP policy provides as a way to kind of maintain their industries. I don't
Well, you know, there's a ongoing controversy now about the Cape Cod hook people, but because basically they got a bigger share than most people because their harvest was sustainable in the sense that they didn't use trawls, and then when they got that big allocation, and this is I guess a concern Oceania, when they got that allocation, they took a significant portion of it and sold it to draggers. So that
that's a
selling
flaw in the
property
system, but
rights.
it's not a flaw in that fishery. I mean, it seems to me that we could highlight those.
well, the thing is, it's not a flaw in the fishery, but people have to realize if you want to have eat cod that is caught on a hook, you're going to have to pay a lot more for the cod, and at some point it doesn't become competitive in various
But that in and of
contexts.
itself is regulatory for the fish, which if it's more expensive, people are gonna buy less of it. So
Well,
maybe,
it will be
and
lower price.
also, where did the policy come from that allows people to sell their share? Is that in the statute?
Well, that's yes.
That's
I mean, the main theme of the cat share system is to have these sectors, these voluntary groups, and I'm in a sector, the same sector as you are, and I can lease my fish to you, and then I believe you can then also lease between sectors. And the problem is we do have individuals that they have a quota. So I lease my quota to you, and so I now don't need a crew.
Right.
And so they're fired.
Right.
Well, is it?
And
Let me ask, Professor Bluestone back
Please.
here, the dean of our school, I want to give him a chance, and then if we have a couple of
This
chances.
may be too broad a question, but knowing nothing about this except I like to fish on the Cape, is to what extent are you on one hand you think that all the fishers have the same common interest. We want to have a fish stock that will survive. But to what extent is there disagreement because we don't have enough science to really understand how big these fish stocks are, the striper issue right now, whether it's overfished or it's a climate problem? And to what extent is it that different fishers have different time horizons? You know, if my great-grandson is going to take over my boat someday, I might have a longer time horizon than if I think I've got 5 more years, I might as well get everything out of the ocean I can. So to what extent is it a time horizon problem? To what extent is it a problem we don't really have as much science as we need?
Anybody want to tackle that?
Yeah.
well,
Are those reasonable
Yeah,
questions?
We don't have as much science as we want, in problems of science or lack of perfection in science become the fuel of controversy and political interference.
Right.
If you had perfect science, then people would have to argue about the real issues. They still wouldn't agree. And this is an important point, because there's often a comment, if we only had the science right. If you had perfect science, perfect information, they still wouldn't agree.
Mm-hmm.
But at least you'd know what they were arguing about rather than confusing it with rhetoric over the science. And your other point is absolutely an important issue of discount rates. One of there's a theory in some place. I was in New Zealand when they totally privatized, and have gone to the point of basically saying we can just hand it over to the industry, society no longer has to worry about it. And that's just patently false, because the discount rate of the industry is basically set by banks and so on. The government has a discount rate that's government policy, and it's a much, much lower discount rate. So clearly you're going to get a mismatch if you just count it on the economics, because there are people having different discount rates.
I think Mike did a good job answering that question. There's a higher level science question. If you want to do ecosystem management, if you want to sustainable all this stuff, you're going to need a new level of science that makes it even less adequate.
I'll give Alexander our last question, of our students.
Going back to the sectors,
Yeah.
From what I understood about them, the point of them was so that you could, within your sector, give and take with your quota.
That's right.
So I don't like you were saying that like you don't need a crew because you're giving part of your quota away. Well, isn't it that if like someone that's in my sector goes out and catches more fish of a certain type that was allocated to them in the quota, they could take from you, and then in return they give you something back. So you're just like, it's like a give and take. It's not like I'm taking from you and getting nothing in return. And I thought that was like supposed to help like the smaller vessels so that they weren't getting pushed out by all the big guys that were getting all of.
Yeah, that's a good point. It does operate that way, but it also operates where they sell quota.
I know they're selling their permits because they can't like afford them.
Quota.
Okay.
Yeah, they're selling permits, but they're also selling quota. And the problem is I'll give you an example. In order to catch 10 pounds of cod, I have to have 1 pound of something else, and the price of that something else goes out of sight because I can catch 10 pounds of cod with it. And now what's happened as we do this trial and error, cut and paste stuff, is that people purchase the quota, and then they go out and they find that the fish aren't there the way that they conceived it, and that they're holding the bag. It's like selling stock short. It's very, I mean, it's like day trading really. When day trading when you don't have any money, because these guys don't have the deep pockets to lose. And so what's happened is that the transactions that were expected are way down, and people just aren't fishing.
You can tell from the nature, the sheer complexity of the issues. You can tell from the range of potential solutions. You can tell from the nature of the politics and everything else that this is one of the most contested issues you could ever imagine in any area. What we call common pool resource management. This is in fact probably the biggest one we can think of sometimes in terms of its complexity and difficulty. And I'm reminded about how not new this whole problem is by every time I go to the state legislature and you look up at the sacred cod. For those of you who are not from Massachusetts, cod fishing has been a bedrock of the economy since the very beginning. And you go into the legislature and you see the sacred cod hanging from the ceiling, and you're reminded that fishing meant something in the state historically. It still does. And I think we could think of no better example of an issue that reflects the difficult choices you have to make at this intersection of government and the market. And indeed, when people's lives are on the line every day, it becomes even more contested, even more dramatic, and more complicated. I'd like to thank you all for coming. We could have gone for hours. I'd like to thank our guests. Members of the audience who are also very, very important. And see you next month when we talk about toxics. February 22nd. Thanks a lot for coming. If you have not signed the sign-in sheet, please do so.